Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we are looking at Nixilis Captive Kingpin. So this is a 4-mana Rakdos commander. It's a 4/3 with flying and trample, and it says, whenever one or more opponents each lose exactly one life, put a +1/+1 counter on Nixilis Captive Kingpin, exile the top card of your library. Until your next end step, you may play that card. So what are we doing here? Well, obviously, we are going to essentially impulse draw cards whenever our opponents lose exactly one life. So that is one or more of them. So you don't get to exile multiple cards per 1 damage. It's just exactly 1 damage. But what we can do is use effects that continuously or repeatedly deal damage or drain life in increments of exactly 1 and get the ability. So Nixilis will grow, which is not irrelevant, but the bigger part and the part that's a lot more enticing is the exiling the top card of our library and being able to play it. So one other thing to note is that because it says until your next end step, if your opponents lose life on their turn, you still get your entire next turn to cast the spell. It only runs out at your end step on your own turn. So if it's during the opponent's turn, they lose life, or they take damage for whatever reason, you exile the top card, you have until your whole next turn to, the end step of your entire next turn to cast that spell. And this effect doesn't just apply to your own stuff that you're using to damage or drain the opponent's life totals, it also applies to any way that they are losing life themselves. So cards like Necropotence, Fetch Lands, etc., all of those will also trigger the Nixilis. So here we've got our enablers. So these are basically cards that are going to deal damage or drain life in increments of exactly 1, and they're going to do it multiple times. So we've got Barbed Wire, 3 mana artifact at the beginning of each player's upkeep. Barbed Wire deals 1 damage to that player. So we can just keep triggering this now. And then you can use 2 mana to prevent the 1 damage from the Barbed Wire, but you'll probably never do that. So this is mostly just, it's essentially drawing you an extra card every turn in combination with Nixilis. You've got Burning Earth, which is whenever a player taps a non-basic land for mana, it deals 1 damage to that player, and Mana Barbs, which is whenever they tap any land, not just non-basics, they take 1 damage. So these are good because every instance of a land being tapped is a separate instance of 1 damage being dealt to them. So if they cast a spell and they tap like 4 or 5 lands, that's 4 to 5 cards that you're getting, since every single land is its own separate instance of the damage. You've got Copper Tablet, which is just like another Barbed Wire, but for less mana. Deal 1 damage to each player during their upkeep. Then you've got the cards that trigger when you cast spells, so Firebrand, Archer, and Kessig Flame Breather both deal 1 damage to all of your opponents whenever you cast a non-creature spell. You've also got Hedron Detonator and Reckless Fireweaver, which trigger to deal 1 damage to an opponent or multiple opponents whenever you have an artifact enter the battlefield. These are going to be relevant for some combos. Like Copper Tablet and Barbed Wire, you also have Roiling Vortex and Sulfuric Vortex, which will deal damage to a player on their upkeep. And then we've also got Urabrask, which is whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, deal 1 damage to target opponent, and you also generate a red mana. There's Cataract Parasite. Whenever an opponent draws a card, if you control a red permanent, you may have Cataract Parasite deal 1 damage to that player. Passionate Archaeologist. Commander creatures you own have, whenever you cast a spell from exile, this creature deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to target opponent. And then lastly, Pyrohemia. At end of turn, if no creatures are in play, sack Pyrohemia, and red, deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. So obviously this is not the full breadth of cards that can do this effect. There's many more that you could include here, like Pyrohemia is a color shifted version of Pestilence, if you wanted to run that. There's other cards that trigger when you cast specifically instants or sorceries, not just any non-creature, unlike Kessig Flame Breather and Firebrand Archer, but I think these are the best ones of those that you could play. Of course, we're going to want a bunch of fast mana, so we've got Burgi, Burnt Offering, Dark Ritual, etc. Pretty stock Rakdos lands, some protection to make sure that Nixilis either doesn't get countered or killed by removal, some ramp, Goblin Engineer to tutor artifacts to the graveyard, which is going to be relevant later, bit of removal and counter spells. Then of course some stacks pieces because we can afford to run them. Since we are exiling cards, not drawing them with Nixilis, the Chains of Mephistopheles is basically an asymmetric stacks piece for us. Also, for the most part, we don't have many activated abilities on creatures, so Curse Totem's fine there. Obviously Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. And then Opposition Agent, Bowmasters, and Shieldred are pretty good stacks pieces in black, with Bowmasters and Shieldred having the additional utility of working with Nixilis since they drain or damage the opponent. We've also got Fire Covenant here as a sweeper and some tutor spells, including Hoarding Broodlord. Now Feshni is a card unique for Nixilis. It's a 6 mana 4/6 flyer, and it says whenever you cast a spell from exile, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. If it's a permanent spell, the copy gains haste, and at the beginning of the next end step, or at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice this permanent. So it works well with Ob Nixilis in that it gets to copy all of your impulse drawn cards, but at the same time, it is 6 mana, which is pretty steep, so this is the card I would most likely cut if you're looking for space. Then we got some just straight up card draw spells, Bolts of Citadel, Necro, Peer into the Abyss, etc. And then we've got all of our combo pieces. So first of all, since we've got Bolus of Citadel, we can of course combine it with Aetherflux Reservoir and Sensei's Divining Top to draw cards off the top of our deck for basically free, and then eventually just gain a bunch of life and Death Star Laser the opponent. We've got Mayhem Devil, which isn't strictly speaking an infinite combo, but it is another way of just continuously dealing damage to our opponents and triggering the Ob Nixilis. And there are a lot of ways to sack things. The Hoarding Broodlord on the first trigger can go find Saw in Half, and then we can Saw in Half it to create 2 Hoarding Broodlords, which will find Burnt Offering and Peer into the Abyss. We use the Burnt Offering to sack the Broodlord to generate 8 mana. We use the 8 mana to cast Peer into the Abyss, and then we should be able to win from there. We've got Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which we can combine with Walking Ballista and Ob Nixilis. So remember that Ob Nixilis says, whenever one or more opponents each lose exactly 1 life, you put a +1 counter on Ob Nixilis. So if we get out Ballista plus Agatha's Soul Cauldron, so we've got Ballista in the graveyard, we exile it with the Soul Cauldron, and then as long as the Ob Nixilis has at least 1 +1 counter on it, which we can put on it via Agatha's Soul Cauldron, we can now have Ob Nixilis gain the abilities of Walking Ballista. So we can remove the +1 counter to deal damage to our opponent, which will trigger the Ob Nixilis to put a +1 counter on it, which we can use to remove to deal 1 damage to our opponent, etc. Infinite damage via the Ob Nixilis. We also have All Will Be One, which indeed also combines with Ob Nixilis. So All Will Be One, the moment we put a counter on anything or deal damage in any way, both of these will chain react back and forth to deal infinite damage. Then we also have a combo that involves getting Ob Nixilis into play along with Prosper Tomebound, Sensei's Divining Top, and then either Reckless Fireweaver or Hedron Detonator. So the steps to doing this are: 1, we cast the top, it triggers the Fireweaver or Hedron Detonator, which will deal at least 1 damage to an opponent. And then while we hold priority with the Ob Nix trigger on the stack, we activate the top, putting it on top of our deck. Then we resolve the Hedron Detonator or Reckless Fireweaver, which damages our opponent, triggering Ob Nixilis to impulse draw the top. We then get to cast the top from exile, and since we're casting a spell from exile, Prosper Tomebound creates a treasure token, and so we're always generating 1 treasure token to be able to cast the top, so we can just keep looping that over and over and over to kill our opponents. Now technically it's not infinite because the top is drawing cards out of our deck, so we can't draw our whole deck, but this will at least kill probably 2 players, if not more, depending on how much life they're at. And also, since we're drawing our whole deck anyway, we should be able to win regardless. And then lastly, Sundial of the Infinite is here because the Ob Nixilis says until your next end step, you may cast the card or you may play the card, which means that if we just end our turn before we go to the end step, that until your next end step part never actually triggers. Like that ability never actually lapses, meaning that if we've got cards that are in exile that we want to cast, but either it's not a good time to cast them or we just don't have the mana to cast them, the Sundial will allow us to keep banking them in exile for as long as we want. So once again, we are a Rakdos deck that's using a combination of various things, stacks, removal, etc., that is trying to set up one of these combos that involves Ob Nixilis, either to deal infinite damage or near infinite damage, or just to generate a ton of value by impulse drawing a bajillion cards, and then either winning by literally dealing infinite damage to opponents, or just outvaluing them to a huge degree, or attritioning them out by damaging them enough times that they eventually lose the game anyway. And yep, that is Ob Nixilis Captive Kingpin.